Everyone. Well, thank you for joining us for our webinar series. We're going to give a couple more minutes for people to jump on. We understand that it is lunchtime and people are wrapping some things up, so we're going to give everybody about 2 more minutes, and then we'll get going. All right. Well, I'm sure we're going to have some people trickle in throughout the webinar session, but just to make sure that we are aware of everyone's time, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Darren McHugh. I am with the DTC. I am the Vice President of Sales and Business Development. And DTC, for those of you who don't know us, we are a dental IT group servicing the Mid-Atlantic area. We service, oh goodness, almost 500 dental offices on a day-to-day basis with support, technical support, cloud backup, with HIPAA security advice, new office build-outs, all kinds of things. Anything related to technology is what we take care of, and we've been doing this since about 1994. So we're the largest dental IT group in the Mid-Atlantic by far, with well over 20 team members, and with our CEO being Steve McNamara. So one of the things that we see in dental, because we've been doing it so long, is that a lot of people have a lot of different questions on lots of different topics. So what we are going to do is we are going to be a resource for our clients to allow them to come to us for items that they have questions on. This is where the origination of the webinar series came from. So we started this back in late last year and have done some fantastic topics on HIPAA, on negotiating with insurance rates, on build-outs, all kinds of things. So they've been very successful. You can actually go back and view our webinars on our website at www.dtctoday.com, and there's a webinar tab there for you to view the past ones as well as register for the upcoming webinars. We do these once a month, the second Thursday of every month at 1 o'clock. But again, those of you who can't make it certainly want to be able to view them online afterwards. Housekeeping items real quick. We're going to go ahead and do about a 10-15 minute presentation with Dr. Tom Bonsack, and then Josh from Bank of America is going to come in on the second part of the webinar and talk to us about selling and buying dental practices and all the different issues that are involved with that. We'll do a 15-minute Q&A afterwards for those of you that want to continue to stay on with us. And then again, this is viewable on our website. Within a week, it should be up on the website. So pass it along to your friends, to your colleagues, or watch it again. So with that being said, I want to go ahead and introduce both Tom and Josh. Dr. Tom Bonsack is the president of Mid-Atlantic Dental Transitions and is really involved and really dialed in on helping practices make these transitions, and Josh Contrucci from Bank of America is able to also provide advice on the financial side and answer those questions. So I'm going to let them sort of take over here. If you have a question, you have a little question tab there that you can go ahead and type in your questions and we'll answer them at the end. Other than that, Tom, thanks for donating your time, and we'll kick it off to you.
Hey, thanks, Darren. This is great of you to invite us to do this webinar. I give this lecture in 2 hours normally, so this is a new venue for me. I'm going to talk to whoever's listening for the next 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll let Josh jump in, and hopefully we'll have some questions at the end that we can clear up any things that we haven't had a chance to talk about initially. So I'm going to run through my lecture and try to hit some of what I think are the important points. I won't be able to cover everything, but again, at the end, whoever's listening can jump in with questions. So I'm either helping buyers or sellers with buying or selling practices. So I'm going to just start with my PowerPoint and talk about why sell to begin with. You know, I talk to people that are interested in selling, and most of the time it's people that are just tired of doing dentistry. They get to the point where they've reached a threshold and they want to either retire or they want to do something different. You know, I do have dentists that are interested in selling and continuing to work as a dentist, but they're tired of managing. I have some people that want to sell, but they want to slow down and work a couple days a week instead of the 4 days a week that they're currently working. And then, you know, the question always is, why not just close your doors? Typically, practices are worth something, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So it would take extreme circumstances just to close your doors, because most practices are sellable. So let me scroll down again. And as a buyer, you know, why buy? Most people that I meet that want to buy a practice, they are associating somewhere and they're tired of, you know, working for someone else. They want to make more money. They want to pay off their debt, and they want to run an office their way. So they are looking for opportunities to have their own thing, so to speak. Let me jump down to what a practice is worth. And this is probably the most common question I get when I meet with sellers. And it's the most common question I get when I speak to buyers that I'm helping when we're looking at practices for them. And I could speak for, you know, a half an hour just talking about this, but I'll get into statistics by keeping it simple and saying that most practices I sell in the Mid-Atlantic area sell between 65% and 80% of gross revenue. To try to even narrow it down further, I would say most practices sell for between 65 and 75% of gross revenue. There are times when they sell for less than 65%, and there are times when they sell for more than 80%. But that's probably the most common statistic I can give you. We could base it on the net of the practice, and I would say that most practices sell between 1.5 times net to 2 times net, and maybe Josh will comment on this a little bit later as he starts to speak as well. But let me scroll down and try to hit a few other things in the time that I have. Let's talk about the cost of selling and buying. If you're a seller, most brokers' fees are 5 to 10% of the sale price, to give you an idea. I see attorney's fees of 5 to 10 grand, depending on whether you're using your own attorney or you're doing what's called neutral counsel. And I see advisor fees for the CPAs being, you know, 1 to 3 grand, depending on how much they're involved in the process. Sometimes they're not involved in the process as much as every situation is a little different, I would say. And then, of course, if you're a seller, you have taxes to pay based on the allocation of the sale price. Most sale prices are broken down into goodwill, equipment, supplies, and covenant not to compete. Uh, the the bulk of the sale normally is goodwill, and typically I see that number at 80% of the sale price, sometimes even 90% of the sale price. But it really depends. As a practical matter, the equipment and what the equipment, the fair market value of the equipment is worth will dictate what the rest of the allocation is. So that's just a general overview of the cost. Most buyers, if you're a buyer, again, you basically have someone advising you, helping you with due diligence. There's no broker fees normally, unless you're involved with a broker that does dual brokerage. You don't have a broker fee. The broker is usually representing the seller. I mentioned neutral counsel because there are times when the buyer and the seller will actually use neutral counsel and split the cost of the attorney. And frankly, I've found this to be very helpful in a lot of situations. I want to talk about a few other things, and this goes towards, should a seller buy new equipment before the sale? And there are certain things that make a practice desirable to a buyer. And having dealt with many young dentists around the country, actually, equipment is important to them. Technology is important to them. And I'm not just saying that because I'm here doing a webinar with Dental Technology Center. If a practice doesn't have up-to-date equipment, regardless of the cash flow involved in a practice, the buyer in their mind is going to discount that practice because that is important to them, and they will need it, whether or not the practice has it currently or not. They're going to need technology. They're going to need digital. So a seller should try to update or keep his office updated so that when the time comes to sell his practice, he has a good practice, hopefully in a good location, with good cash flow and with up-to-date technology. Let's see what else we can talk about when we, as I scroll down here. Let me just talk about the sequence a little bit and what a typical transition is like. I didn't get into a lot of what the seller and buyer need to do to get ready because of the time frame here, but there are things that a seller should be doing to get ready for a sale, and there are things that a buyer should be doing to get ready. Buyers want to be, honing their clinical skills, their personal skills, their business skills. And Josh could comment on this, but typically the banks aren't going to give a buyer a loan until they've been working for a while and showing a level of production. The seller needs to get his office in order, get his financials in order. As I talked about the technology a little bit. It's up to the seller to come up with an asking price. Typically he gets help from a broker or whoever's helping him to come up with an asking price to sell the practice, and then once the asking price has been established, again, the practice is marketed to buyers in the area. Hopefully, it's a desirable practice, and to comment on what makes a practice desirable to young buyers, as I mentioned already, technology makes a practice desirable. Cash flow makes a practice desirable. The banks, the buyers advisors want to see practices that are profitable. And that is one thing. If a practice isn't profitable, the seller has time to work on that. It may take a year, 2, 3 years to get a practice profitable so that he can get the most, or she can get the most out of the practice sale. So market the practice to find a buyer. Once a buyer is found, typically a letter of intent is signed, which is a non-binding agreement between the buyer and seller. with the general terms of the practice sale, so that the attorneys basically have a framework of what to put into their contracts for the buyer and the seller. The contracts, the APA, which is an asset purchase agreement, there are typically leases involved, depending on whether it's privately owned or a building is sold. So you'll have contracts to deal with, and then once the contracts are resolved, you have a closing. I should mention that nowadays a big part of this, because so many practices are PPO practices, the buyer will have to get credentialed in the seller's location, and that can be time consuming sometimes. Frankly, that can take the longest amount of time than everything in this transition sequence, because if you can find a buyer relatively quickly, the contracts can be done pretty quickly, and the credentialing sometimes can take 60 to 90 days, depending on the insurance companies. A lot of people think that just because you're credentialed in one location, you just need to dealt with that when I was in practice, and now I'm dealing with that while I'm helping others with transitions. So it does take time for the credentialing to get done. In the end, transition time, what's a typical transition look like? And I'll finish here after talking about this, and then I'll let Josh jump in for a while. Transitions vary a lot depending on the buyer and seller involved. I have sellers that want to be gone very quickly. I have sellers that want to work part-time for a period of time. I have buyers that want the seller to be there for a period of time. I have buyers that want the sellers to be gone very quickly. We're all different personalities. We all have different needs. So every transition is sort of custom made to what's going to work for that particular buyer and seller. And frankly, sometimes their needs and wants don't mesh, and for that reason alone, it doesn't end up being a good fit. From my perspective, what is necessary, from my perspective, having sold my practice myself and transition, necessary to me is a seller needs to finish up cases, a seller needs to advise the buyer as far as how everything works in the office, where everything is, introduce the patients, the staff, and he could or she could be gone within 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. Now, that's not a good fit for everybody. That's not a good fit for every buyer, and that's not a good fit for every seller. I would say, if I had advice, the simplest advice I have for sellers is be flexible. You need to be flexible. And the simplest advice I would have for a buyer is preserve goodwill, meaning during this process, sometimes the negotiations are very important to the buyer and his advisor. And my advice to the buyer is don't ruin the goodwill during the negotiations. I see too much of that. So I'm going to hand it over to Josh at this point. Darren, if you want to jump in, and I'll let Josh talk for a while.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom. So yeah, I'd like to go ahead and take a moment to introduce Josh Conchucci from Bank of America. Josh is definitely able to give a great deal of light, or shed a great deal of light on the financial side. So there's always those constraints, those financial items that you need to be aware of. So Josh, I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Tom. I will jump in quickly. There'll be some slides I'll probably skip over, but we'll try to cover as much as I can, during the time that we have. So, again, Josh Conchucci. I work for our Bank of America Practice Solutions team. We do all healthcare financing for the bank. I personally only work with dentists, primarily dentists that are doing a transition. So it's really, my forte. So that this slide kind of gives you an idea of what that looks like. So today's lending market, the banks, similar to ours, who have focused on dental transitions, haven't realized the same loss or delinquency that that some banks have experienced over the course of the last few years, where there's situations that come up where people are worried, like, can I get the money? Is money available? How hard is it to get a loan? What I would say is that absolutely, lending is pretty pretty easy, relatively easy for a dentist to get 100% financing. So for any buyers out there worried about having to put money down, typically that's not the case. For any sellers that are worried about not being able to get all their money at the time of closing, that's typically not the case. Almost always 100% financing is available, and that can be done relatively easily, like I said. How do we kind of get that? So what are we looking for from a buyer in particular? There's kind of several lists of those. One, credit. So most of the time when I talk with a buyer, even if it's early in the process, maybe they haven't found a practice that they're interested in buying, we can do a pre-qualification. It's an easy, quick, cost-free look at their buying capability. So most of the time I ask basically 3 or 4 simple questions. The first is, what's your credit like? We're not a credit score-based lender, so it's not necessarily what's your credit score. You don't necessarily get more credit, if you will, for 800 credit score versus a 750 credit score. It's really just about, have you made your payments over the last 12 months? Have you made your payments for the last 24 months? Do you have any delinquencies? Have you had any charge-offs? Have you had any foreclosures? Are there anything that's out there that would cause alarm? If none of that's the case, then usually you have good credit and you're credit worthy enough based on the credit report. The capital piece, so one of the other questions I'll ask is, in terms of your cash on hand, so how much money have you been able to save over the time that you've been licensed? We look for some type of capital, not necessarily for you to put the money down, but just in case something happens, you have some money to fall back on. So you have some cash reserves, 3 to 6 months of kind of payments just in case. It shows good character, it shows good wherewithal, those kinds of things. And again, there's not really a specific benchmark to that. Obviously, the higher the loan amount, the more important that becomes. But we like to see that somebody has some cash on hand. The capacity, so the total debt load piece is another vital piece. So we're cash flow based lenders. We base most of our decision on how much money you're going to be able to make, and is that going to be able to support the loan and your personal debt. So that's a big piece of it. The other question that I'll ask buyers, besides credit and cash on hand, is time licensed. So how long have you been licensed? So as Tom mentioned, if you don't have a lot of experience, we typically need to see at least a year as an associate working, usually a little bit more than that depending on the amount of money that you need. So how long have you been licensed, and then what's your production like? So how much have you been able to earn over that period of time? How much production are you able to do? Does that fit then the practice you're looking at buying? If you're looking at a practice with revenues of $1.5 million and clinical dentistry there, less hygiene is $1 million. Obviously, that takes somebody pretty special to be able to produce that kind of dentistry. We want to see that, yes, you have that capacity to be able to do something like that. So those are the kind of 3 to 4 main questions I'll ask a buyer. And then, the most important aspect is, again, kind of what I described, which is that cash flow. So how much money are you going to be able to make? Is that going to be able to support your debt? So really, debt service coverage is kind of the idea. I'll skip through some of those slides. So as Tom mentioned as well, the most important piece, like really what are you buying in a dental practice? You're buying the equipment, usually used equipment, not a whole lot of value there. You're buying supplies, again, not a whole lot of value there. Really what you're buying is that goodwill. So the expectation of continued patronage, meaning are the patients going to keep coming to the practice and continue to then, pay for services there? In our experience as a lender, it happens. We wouldn't be in business very long if it didn't happen because, again, we base our decision on the fact that patients are going to continue, and historically how has this practice performed cash flow-wise, that would then continue for a new buyer. It almost always happens that way. As long as the transition is done well and the goodwill is transferred, well. So again, that kind of what quote at the end, success is predicated on the ability of the seller to transfer the goodwill to the buyer. So as a buyer, again, one of the pitfalls is, kind of, causing some headache during that transition, whatever, there's so many different examples out there where the goodwill isn't transferred as well, and, it ends up happening is the transition would then suffer after that point. So it's really important, obviously, to focus on that goodwill transfer, be flexible, as Tom mentioned, and those kinds of things. So that's the main piece of what you're buying, and what we look for. Pros and cons of buying a practice versus maybe starting your own. The easiest way to sum up this slide is the pros is you're buying cash flow. You're buying an existing patient base. You're buying that continued patronage. So you're buying, for lack of a better term, an ATM machine, right? I mean, you can go, that money comes. The con, the easiest way to sum up that side of it is you could commit potentially buying somebody else's problems. So you really want to do some due diligence there and understand what you're getting into. Is there anything kind of behind the curtain? Any issues that you may not be able to see? What procedures are being done there? Can you do all of those procedures or not? All those kinds of things. So really understand what you're kind of getting into. I talked about that pre-qualification piece, free look for any buyer. It really gives you an idea of what you could qualify for, speeds up the process a little bit. The sellers, brokers in particular, know that you're a serious buyer if you've already talked to a bank, and they can really review that, hey, this person isn't out there just kind of kicking tires. They're ready to move forward if the right practice comes along. So it's an important piece that we can do. It doesn't take very long at all. Tom had mentioned kind of the steps in looking at a practice. So really, identifying that practice, cash flow is really the main thing that we're going to look at as a bank. So the more that a seller's tax returns can be clean, meaning there's not a lot of expenses, personal expenses that are being filtered through. We are not the IRS. We don't check that. We don't do that. We're not reporting anything. But really, we want to see enough money coming out to be able to support everything. So the easier it is for us to see that, the easier it is then for a buyer to get money and qualify. So that's important for sellers to understand. And then the growing steady production piece is another really important aspect. So, we see all the time, and I get it, where practices are on a decline and then they're selling. You take some time off, you're just not working as hard, and that happens. What selling doctors then have to understand is you're not going to be able to get the same amount of money as if you were, 2 or 3 years ago when it was producing more. It's harder to sell a practice when the production is going down, because the question that comes up is, where's the bottom of it? Is it going to keep going down? When it's trending down, then it may trend down for the buyer even more. Where's the bottom, and then when can it kind of come back up for them? So the sooner you recognize that, yes, I'm just ready to sell, the better it is. The kind of Barry Sanders example, he retired, early. He retired on the upswing, when, things were going well for him, as opposed to, winding down his career, and you see him in all these different jerseys and everything else, and your impression of him is a little less than before. So it's really, selling earlier is usually better. And sometimes, I think Tom mentioned, you don't necessarily have to sell your whole practice. You can sell, continue to work, depending on the size, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of different transition options out there. So that kind of covers that piece. Again, kind of that cash flow. I'll go through this really quickly. There's a lot of numbers on this page. But, Tom mentioned that why are you buying? You're buying to make more money. So in the end, in this particular example, where total cash flow from a practice is $270,000, the practice loan is about $50,000. So that $270,000 minus the loan payment to the bank is about $220,000 to the buyer in this particular case. Not, that's on the higher side, if not, much more than a lot of associates would make. Most I see in the 150, maybe 170 range. So in essence, in this particular example, that buyer is going to be making $220,000 more than they'd be making as an associate. They also own the practice, so they have some tax write-offs and those kinds of things as well. So it's a good investment for them. Even if they have student loans, which is a big concern, how am I going to qualify for that? The practice in this case is covering everything. So even though you're taking out more debt, it's an investment, right? That practice is going to pay for the debt. It's an important piece. And then what we look for is we look for a $1.20 ratio for every dollar that goes out. So in this example, it's $1.38 earned for every dollar. So this is a good transition for somebody. And then approval is based on that. Startup financing, we can go through because it's not important. And then what to look for in a particular loan. So just real quickly, there's a lot of aspects of a loan that aren't necessarily just interest rate. I get the question all the time, what's your interest rate? What's my interest rate going to be? Clearly, that's an important piece of the loan, but it's not the only thing necessary to look at. So in these two examples, loan A, 4.9% is an interest, loan B, 4.25. Which one would you choose? Clearly, you choose loan B. It's a lower interest rate. That's the only factor you have to consider at this point. Loan A is over a 10-year term. Loan B is over a 7-year term. Which one now? Well, you may still choose loan B, but it's something else to look at. Your monthly payment's going to be lower in loan A than it is in loan B. So one other thing to consider. Loan A is going to be fixed for the entire term. Loan B is only fixed for 36 months. So it balloons after that 36-month period. At that point, maybe loan B isn't such a great choice. But again, another factor to look at. Here, loan A, you can rate lock for up to 4 months. We're right now in definitely a lot rising rate environment. So rates are going up. So from the point that you choose a loan to close, you could get to the closing table and your rate be higher. In loan A's example, you can lock your rate so that there's no surprises. And loan B, it's only locked for 30 days. It may change. In loan A, you're approved for $450, which is 100% financing. In loan B, you have to put money down, and there's a 3% documentation fee as well. Loan A, you can principally reduce. Loan B, there's a payment penalty to have to reduce principal on the loan. Loan A, loan B, you can see, and there's other examples that you can really look at. But again, it's not necessarily just interest rate that you would focus on. There's a lot of other questions and concerns out there. So that's in a nutshell what I had to cover. If there are other questions out there, then we can certainly field those.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Josh. Both Josh and Tom bring a great deal of knowledge and experience to this topic, and they're in this every day. So they see the pitfalls, they see the things that are definitely the to-dos. So I would encourage everyone to continue to reach out to them and use them as a resource. Even if you're in that point where you're just sort of thinking about things, as I tell my 7-year-old, if you're going to start to make a decision, think about everything beforehand. So start weighing in on all the options. Get as much advice as you can. I've got some questions here for Josh and Tom. We've got a couple minutes left, so I'll shoot these out to you, and you guys can either respond if you feel it's more for you, or both respond, however it works. So one of the questions that I see here is, why are associate contracts important?
Josh, do you want me to cover that, or we can?
Yeah, I mean, we can both jump in, but you can start.
Okay. Yeah, Josh and I were talking about this at lunch or breakfast yesterday. Yeah, the associate contracts are important. If you're a seller, the associate contract, if you have an associate working at your practice, that associate contract should have a covenant not to compete. If you have a long-term associate working at your practice and that person doesn't have a covenant not to compete, if I was representing a buyer and I looked at that practice for sale, I would not be interested in that practice because there would be too much risk to the buyer that that associate could leave and set up a practice nearby. So it's very important for sellers to have their associate sign a covenant not to compete so they don't put themselves in a position where the practice may be either unsellable or sell at a lower price because the buyers aren't going to want to assume that risk. Josh?
Yeah, and like we talked about yesterday, Tom, just as a real world example, I had worked on a transition a couple of years ago, and it was this particular case where the practice was primarily run by an associate. It was a second office for someone where the value of the practice, or what the practice valuation that was done, was about $450,000. But it turned out that associate did not have any non-compete or contract, and ultimately the practice ended up selling for about $150,000. So the value clearly dramatically dropped simply because the risk to a buyer in that case goes up exponentially. Now, we were still able to finance that, but would we have been able to do that? Would the bank have been able to finance it at $450,000? No, we wouldn't have. We would have seen the same risk. I mean, that's what banks do. They measure risk in a transition. Is it a worthwhile loan for us to make? What's the risk in somebody being able to pay you back or not? And in that case, it was too high at that number. We could do it at $150,000, but clearly that's a lot of money less for that owner. So it's vital for anybody to have, if you have an associate, for that associate to have a contract, specifically non-compete.
Okay, good. Next question: does the size of the facility matter? And I'll open that both up for both of you guys.
Josh, I'll jump in first.
Yeah, go ahead.
That question is important to most buyers that I speak to. I find just from talking to a lot of buyers, they don't particularly like smaller office sizes. They're used to having fairly large offices. What I mean by fairly large, myself, I started practicing in 1986. For us, a 3 or 4 op practice was pretty typical. We weren't really looking for bigger offices, 5, 6, 7 operatory practices. To a buyer, I find that 3 and 4 operatory practices tend to be on the small size side, and that sometimes is a deterrent to them to buying the practice. Now, obviously, that's not the only consideration, and I certainly don't think it's as critical as some of the other important considerations such as cash flow, location, visibility, et cetera, but I have found that the smaller offices for the newer, younger dentists tend to be a factor.
Yeah, and from bank's perspective, the size of the practice, you know, there's always a "it depends" statement. So it does depend, but for the vast majority of the time, we really don't care. You know, it doesn't matter. A buyer isn't going to necessarily qualify for anything different depending on if a practice is 1,000 square feet or 2,000 square feet. It's just the nature of how that practice is performed, you know, historically, and that's really all we're concerned about.
Okay. One more question here, then we're getting close to our time here. This one's probably for you, Tom. Should the seller send a letter to the patients, and when?
That's a good question. And depending on which one of us you talk to, when I say us, I mean advisors, you might get a different answer. If I'm representing a seller, obviously we don't send out any letters until the seller's been paid, so that we make sure that the deal is done before we send a letter to patients letting them know that, you know, there's a new dentist in the practice. The letter is really important for the buyer, more important for the buyer than it is for the seller. I like letters. How letters are written from transition to transition varies tremendously. There are times when we have people that sell practices and the seller is staying on, and we don't really word it in such a fashion that the practice has been sold. We word it in such a fashion that, you know, someone's being, you know, added to the practice. So the letter is super important. It's a way for sellers to say thank you. It's a way for them to talk up the buyers, or in the case of how it's written, it may be a situation where we're just saying we're bringing in someone new. But certainly it shouldn't be sent out until the deal is done. And it should be written in such a fashion that it doesn't scare patients away. That's the important thing when the letter is written, because we want to get the best chance of the transfer of goodwill. So we don't want to put things in the letter that will scare the current patients of the practice away.
Definitely makes sense. So, well, we are running out of time. So just one last thing. Again, I want to thank Tom and Josh for donating their time. They are very busy, and I really do appreciate them spending the time with us to get more information out. I also want to go ahead and show you that there are the other webinars listed on our website. So this is our website here. So on the webinar tab, you can see the upcoming webinars and you can see the webinar recordings. So when you click on the upcoming webinars, you will go ahead and see the calendar of events that's coming up, and simply just go ahead and click on register, and you'll be able to see the ones, you'll be able to register for the ones in the future. You will notice that our next one is on May 11th, and that is going to be on compensation of staff and team harmony. Huge topic in the culture of a practice. It's going to be given by Dixie Romano of Henry Schein. And then again, if you haven't been able to watch some of the other webinars, go up to that webinar tab again, hit webinar recordings, and you'll be able to see all the different webinars that we have already facilitated this year. We've had, again, all these partners are donating their time, some valuable information. They're quick listens, 30 to 45 minutes, lots and lots of good information in there. Again, pass this on to any of your colleagues. Watch as much as you can, and just as importantly, feel free to reach out to Josh. Feel free to reach out to Tom or myself if you have any questions about this topic or others related to it. So, again, we want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for giving up your time and your lunch hours to be part of the webinar, and we look forward to seeing you again or having you attend on May 11th at 1 o'clock. And we'll talk to you then. Enjoy your day, everyone.
Thank you.